Today's session is the only one in the class where we're going to get into the details of the Iran situation, which obviously, if you're following the news, is not just of historical interest. So these slides are up on recourse. Thanks to Molly. And I'm going to go through a number of points here. The first part rather quickly, because it doesn't deal so much with the nuclear stuff, but it has a lot of background information about Iran. A few of you are in my other class. This is a sort of repeat of my other lecture. You just have to come inside this one time. So one general point was in recent years, obviously 9/11 was a hugely influential development for the United States and for President Bush, and led to his decision to send large numbers of forces into Afghanistan and Iraq to fight, in the former case, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban, in the latter case, the Iraqi government of Saddam Hussein. This turned out to be very controversial decisions, particularly with respect to Iraq, generated a lot of opposition in the U.S., and as was often the case, the follow-on president takes a position totally contrary to the predecessor. So in this case, in the 2008 election, Senator Obama stipulated that Iraq was the wrong war and Afghanistan was the right war. So we had no business going into Iraq because it had no relationship to 9/11. But that, yes, Al-Qaeda was based in Afghanistan, and that was the place it came to be. Over the 8 years of the Obama presidency, he was generally reluctant to use military force, reluctant to so-called have boots on the ground, didn't want to go to Dover, Delaware to greet caskets of Americans coming home dead. But it didn't mean that he didn't follow and support American national security interests, many of which he shared with the Bush administration. But he did it by other means. So it was a tactical shift more than a strategic shift by Obama. And in particular, he used these techniques, advanced technologies like cyber and drones, special forces, small groups of very highly trained clandestine forces, such as in the raid to kill bin Laden, economic sanctions, and negotiations as an alternative to large forces on the ground. And although we're early in the Trump period, and he's very inconsistent and hard to decipher, we do seem to see a pattern that he stated as a candidate, that he's reluctant to use substantial forces on the ground. And this is most recently illustrated in his comment about withdrawal from Syria, which he mentioned a few days ago, and I gather he has reversed his position on today. So it's hard to track the Trump strategy, such as it is. Now, let's talk a little bit about Iran. Some of you know quite a lot about Iran, some of you don't. Iran is the country's name in Persian. It's the inheritor of great Persian empires that go back from the 6th century to the early part of the 20th century, 1925. Iran is a Persian country, not an Arab country. It's a Shia country, not a Sunni country. You know, thumbnail difference between Shia and Sunni. When Muhammad died in the 7th century, there was no plan and means of succession to spread Islam. And the dispute arose as to whether his key advisors should select the successor or whether the successor should be a blood relative of Muhammad. Those who supported the blood relative thesis became Shia. those who supported the wise men option became Sunni. Over time, the Sunni became far more populous than the Shia. Today, there are 1.3, 1.4 billion Muslims, of which there are about 300 million Shia and about 1 billion Sunni. And almost all the Arab countries are Sunni. So Iran is situated in a part of the world where they are a distinct minority, both ethnically and religiously. It's a large country. It's got over 80 million people. It's the second largest country in landmass to Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. It's got a lot of borders. In the north and northwest, there are former republics of the Soviet Union, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Turkmenistan. In fact, in 1941, Iran was invaded through those countries by the Soviet Union. The Caspian Sea is also in the north. Afghanistan and Pakistan in the east, both non-Arab Sunni states. And very important strategically, the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman in the south, which connects the Straits of Hormuz, a central choke point between the Gulf and open ocean area. Iran's ability to control the Straits of Hormuz would be a critical advantage in the event of war. And Turkey and Iraq are to the west of Iran. Turkey, a non-Arab Sunni state. Iraq, an Arab Shia state. The Saudi GDP is larger than the Iranian, but on the other hand, the Saudis only have 30 million people, so Iran has much more capability overall than Saudi Arabia. Any questions on that material? How do I connect on this? So now more recently, not that recently, but in the early 1950s, Iran had a democratic election, and Mossadegh was elected as the president of Iran. He promised that if elected, he would seek to begin to control the largely British-run oil industry in Iran. Didn't originally claim that he would seize them, that he would nationalize them, but that he would begin the control of them. This is viewed as very threatening to the British. Also, given the location of Iran adjacent to the Soviet Union, this was considered a possible threat to the U.S. containment policy of the Soviet Union. When Mossadegh was elected in '51, Truman was president, and there were actually discussions under Truman about overthrowing Mossadegh, and Truman rejected it, saying we don't do that, especially in a country that's not a direct core threat to the U.S. national interest. But the issue was raised again when Eisenhower became president, and Churchill was British Prime Minister, and Eisenhower and Churchill agreed that they should overthrow Mossadegh. The operation was led by the CIA and led by Kermit Roosevelt, President Roosevelt's son. This is a hugely significant development in Iranian history because it's considered a fundamental thorn in the side of Iran and has fueled their deep anti-American sentiment all these decades, even though, of course, there are hardly any Americans alive who know anything about this or could care less. So, key source of Iranian anti-American sentiment was the overthrow of Mossadegh. Mossadegh was replaced by the Shah Pahlavi, the peacock throne. Pahlavi was a largely sectarian figure, not a religious figure. It was said in 25 years as the head of Iran, he visited St. Moritz at least twice a year to ski, but never once made it to Mecca or Medina, the holiest sites of Islam. And he's presiding over a country that's deeply religious, Shia Islam. The Shah adopted this is not on the list here, a pro-American and even pro-Israeli policy. He shared intelligence information with Israel. Remember, they're not Arab, they're Persian, so they don't have great positive sentiment toward the Arab world. This whole history of Persians fighting the Arabs throughout the century. He was considered by President Carter in the 70s a voice, an island of stability in a sea of turmoil. Because he was considered to be a very stable leader. He was not a democratic leader, he was an authoritarian leader. He had founded the Savak, their secret intelligence service based upon training from the CIA, which was extremely brutal in repressing opposition in Iran. So you have here a secular, non-religious, pro-Western, authoritarian leader of a Shia anti-American state. And despite various problems with the Shah, he was able to suppress all internal dissent until the late 1970s, which was in the middle of the Carter administration. There had been a key religious figure, Ayatollah Khomeini, who had been exiled by the Shah in 1963, who went to Paris, and largely was ineffective in doing much to threaten the Shah, till the late 70s. And then in 1978, this is the pre-email, pre-internet era, in 1978, the Ayatollah, who was in a Paris suburb and a very eloquent speaker, recorded audio tapes of his remarks, calling on the people to rise up against the Shah. And those audio tapes were smuggled into Iran, particularly in the rural areas, which were the most deeply religious areas of Iran. And they were very inspirational to the populace. And the populace started demonstrations against the Shah. Now, in the Iranian case, these were not greeted by the military so much, but paramilitary forces and police who killed a number of the demonstrators. And according to Shia Islam, if there are people killed in such circumstances, there's a 40-day mourning period, after which is resumption of demonstrations. So if you follow the history of Iran in 1978, there are demonstrations, killing the demonstrations, mourning period, more demonstrations, and began to build up a crescendo of its own. So as 1978 progressed, it became increasingly clear that there was a lot of opposition to the Shah, and Carter was in a bit of a conundrum as to what to do about it. Carter had divisions within his advisory council, between Zbig Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor, who was talking about U.S. military force to aid the Shah to keep him in power, and Cyrus Vance, the Secretary of State, who was deeply opposed to that. Another key issue that was unknown in the U.S. at the time was that the Shah had a terminal cancer condition, which would clearly have affected his decisiveness and decision-making ability. I mentioned in the other class, it was interesting that in the fall of 1978, Foreign Affairs, it's a very prominent policy-oriented journal that is read by government leaders and some academics all over the world, especially for U.S. policy statements. They wanted to do an article on Iran, and there were very few Iranian experts in the U.S. And they recruited a man named James Bill, an academic at the University of Texas who went to William & Mary eventually. He was a well-known Iranian specialist. He married an Iranian, he spoke Farsi, he had lived in Iran. And they wanted to not only have him write about the analysis of what was going on, but make some predictions about what would happen. And Bill stipulated in his article that there were 5 possibilities for the future of Iran. One was that the Shah would ride it out and he would succeed in staying in power, which Bill thought by the early fall of '78 was not likely. The second was that he would abdicate but transfer his authority to his family, his son or his wife. This would be the retention of the so-called peacock throne in Iran, which would be very amenable to American interests. Bill also thought that was unlikely. Third was that there were Iran has a very sophisticated middle class, large numbers of people educated in Europe and elsewhere, and many of them were influential in the parliament under the Shah. And Bill stipulated that perhaps these so-called liberal Democrats, or derisively called the Gucci loafer set, because they used to go to Paris to buy their shoes, and Italian shoes, and so very, very, very affluent individuals, that they would seize power. He thought there was a 30–35% chance that would happen. The fourth option, according to Bill, was there'd be a military takeover. The military would get tired of the military is largely secular. They get tired of these largely Shia demonstrators, and they would just seize power and overthrow the Shah. Bill thought that also was a real possibility. And fifth and finally, there was a small Tudeh party, TUDEH, which is the Communist Party of Iran, linked to the Soviet Union. And Bill speculated there was only like a 10% chance that they would have the clout to seize power. So to summarize, Bill thought that the options were the Shah stays in power, his family stays in power, the liberal Democrats take power, the military takes power, or the communists take power. What option was he missing?
The Islamists take power.
Yeah, the Islamic opposition to the Shah. He didn't even include that as an option. It seemed so far-fetched that this guy sitting on a rug in Paris suburbs could be so powerful. I mean, the Shah had F-15s, he had an incipient nuclear weapons program. He had vast numbers of elite, educated people in Tehran and cities who were supportive of it. It seemed totally implausible to this expert, America's best expert on Iran, that the religious fundamentalists could take power. The journal was published December 15, 1978, and 3 weeks later, the Shah fled Iran, made his way to Mexico, and a few weeks after that, Khomeini returned from Paris and established the Islamic Republic of Iran, which exists to this day. Now, it's very important to note that the Shah was seen as such a heathen, such a terrible character by the vast majority of people in Iran that the revolution was overwhelmingly supported by the Iranian population. They didn't quite know what would happen, but they thought almost anything would be better than the Shah. But the Shah He had his own medical problems. He wanted to go to the U.S. for medical treatment. From Mexico, Carter was Hamlet-like, tortured about whether to do that, and ultimately agreed to do it. And I think the Shah went to the Cleveland Clinic where he was treated, but the treatment failed and he died. At the time of the Shah going to the U.S. treatment, that was deeply insulting to the Iranian regime. And not long after that, a group of young Iranian students and paramilitary folks went to the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and seized it, taking 52 hostages, U.S. diplomats, some intelligence people, some military people, and they were held hostage for 444 days. That's over a year. This was a big deal at that time, for those of us who remember. In fact, the television program Nightline with Ted Koppel was begun at the beginning of that hostage crisis. And he used to come on the program every night and say, this is day 23 of the hostage crisis, this is day 39, this is day 87, this is day 245. This was a water torture for the American people that Carter seemed unable or unwilling to do anything about these hostages. The U.S. by this time was termed the Great Satan by the Iranian government. We were now bitter enemies, Khomeini and the U.S. And Carter was torn about what to do, in part because it was also a presidential re-election year, 1980. And he was advised by some of his advisors to try to rescue the hostages. That again split the Carter leadership. Brzezinski supported it, Vance opposed it. And actually, after we tried it and it failed, this is what happened next, Vance resigned. This is very unusual for Secretary of State to resign over a major policy difference. Here we actually just recently had the reverse of this, where we had a Secretary of State who clearly did disagree with the president, but who wanted to stay on, who was fired by the president. So it's, the president was briefed on a paramilitary mission involving 8 helicopters going to the desert in Tehran surreptitiously, and then having special forces go to Tehran to free the hostages. That was agreed to by Carter, and it failed. There was unusual windstorms the day the helicopters landed in the desert. Sand got into the rotors of the helicopters. 2 of the helicopters crashed. The whole thing became a mess, and it was aborted. Carter went on national television to apologize to the American people for this. It was much worse than if he had never done it before. It was a huge political catastrophe for Carter. And he was running against Reagan, a very charismatic, relatively simple messenger of a few core ideas. And this was a tremendous benefit to the Reagan presidential campaign. And if you look at polling data, the rescue mission took place in October of 1980, just a month before the election. And the data just crosses like that. And Reagan won a huge victory. Carter was decisively defeated in the 1980 presidential election. Now, there's another interesting angle here that came out later, which is there were rumors, and then there was actually a congressional investigation as to whether Reagan tried to dissuade the Khomeini regime from releasing the hostages before the election. And there was some speculation, it never was proven, that Reagan's vice president, who was George H.W. Bush, who became president later, went to meet with the Iranians to dissuade them from releasing the hostages until after the election, so Reagan could be elected. I was telling the other class that I was in graduate school with a naval officer who became Carter's chief Iranian advisor during this entire period. And he was so convinced that that was a correct interpretation that he wrote a book about it and became a very active spokesman against the Reagan-Bush administration. And there were congressional hearings about it, but to my knowledge, it was never proved. So I hope you're getting what's going on here. This is complicated stuff. Also at this time, Khomeini, two other things about Khomeini I want to mention. One is stipulating death to Israel as a core foreign policy objective of Iran, using Al-Quds, the Arabic name of Jerusalem, as the name of the military parade, which they held every year. Every year they say death to America, death to Israel. Every year they have a demonstration. The other thing that Khomeini is known for is when he first came back from Paris to seize power, he made a very inspirational speech to the Iranian people, but more broadly to the people of the Middle East, saying, urging them to get up off their knees. That not only the Iranians, but the whole Arab world, the whole Muslim world, have been exploited for centuries by the Christian European, North Americans, the imperialists, and that he showed from a Paris suburb what he could do to overthrow a major ally of these imperialists. And he urged all the Middle East countries to do the same in their country. And even though he was a Shia and a Persian, he was very, very inspirational to many Arab Sunnis. And the death to Israel feature of his foreign policy was exploiting the fact that the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories was a huge grievance throughout the Muslim world, as it is to this day. And it wasn't really part of his original anti-Shah policy. It became part of his Iranian government policy. Because actually the Palestinians are mostly Sunni, not the Shia, and they're Arab, not Persian. And he's also utilized the support of Hezbollah, which is a Shia Lebanese group, to further his policy. This is the name. Life gets complicated because not long after the Shah takes power in 1980, Iraq and Saddam Hussein attack Iran. An Arab Sunni who was running an Arab Shia country attacked a Persian Shia country. And that was a brutal war. There were chemical weapons used in that war. And Reagan, who was in power during the vast part of that war, supported Saddam Hussein against Khomeini, arguing that Saddam Hussein was just your sort of run-of-the-mill authoritarian Arab leader, whereas Khomeini represented a major idea that was threatening to the West. There were other twists and turns. After 9/11, 9/11, of course, was instigated by Al-Qaeda, a Sunni Arab group. 15 of the 19 attackers in 9/11 were from Saudi Arabia, the pinnacle of Sunni Muslim world. Iran actually offered Bush some support for U.S. forces in Afghanistan because Iran is adjacent to Afghanistan, knew something about Afghanistan, but Bush rejected the offer. And actually, in January of 2002, right after Bush had authorized U.S. forces in Afghanistan, which was September of 2001, but before, while he was building up support to invade Iraq, didn't happen until May of 2003, Bush made a major foreign policy address in the State of the Union address, January of 2002. It was the first major address by the President of the United States after election. And he coined the term axis of evil, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, as the three greatest enemies of the United States. So from that time on, if not before, there was the deepest possible hostility between Iran and the United States. Any questions about that? Evolution of governments. Now we come to the Iran nuclear program. Now the Shah have been interested in an Iran nuclear program from almost the outset of his tenure. I mentioned in the other class I taught at Harvard's Kennedy School in the 1970s and 1980s, had close ties with the MIT nuclear engineering department. There were times in the late 70s when over half the nuclear engineering graduate students at MIT were from Iran. They had world-class people there. Most of them were involved in the current Iranian program. So any notion that they're sitting there on their rugs, sipping tea, thinking gibberish thoughts, this is total nonsense. These are world-class technologies. The Shah had visions that Iran would become a great power, a world power. That Iran had a slope of the curve of its GDP that would make it the fifth most powerful economic power. And he wanted to have military might to go along with that. And all that was, so that's his first 2 points. That was all inherited by Khomeini. But Khomeini then had the war with Iraq to deal with. Is this a protest against the Iranians? So in the 1990s in particular, started even a little earlier than that, there was an effort by the Iranian government to increase its centrifuge capability. Now, Khomeini, the Ayatollah, was a revered figure, plus he was father of the revolution. He was a very prominent cleric. He was a very prestigious religious figure. He died. And then there was a fight over who would replace him. Again, of course, no legitimized means of succession. And Khomeini was replaced by Khamenei. Where is that? Somewhere.
He was on the previous slide.
On the previous slide. It's all similar sounding name. Khamenei is not a revered religious figure, not an eminent individual, but more of a political compromise candidate who replaced Khomeini. But very active in trying to enhance Iran's capabilities, yes.
Is he supposed to be a blood relative of Muhammad? They're Shia?
No. No. Yeah, it raises interesting questions about that. There is, in fact, there is no Shia leader of Islam. There are a number of Shia governments. Iraq has a Shia government. Bahrain has a Shia government. There's no hope for Shia Islam. The Iranians had a goal of producing 50,000 centrifuges. Now we know we're talking here about acquiring nuclear weapons-grade material. We have nuclear material in nature. 99.3% U-238, 0.7% U-235. You need to get at that U-235 and accumulate it in order to build a bomb. And that can be done using gas centrifuge and other means, which Isabel has discussed today. Iran, an oil-producing state, lots of income from oil, had tremendously close economic ties with many of the European countries, particularly the Germans and the French. The Siemens Company, a world-renowned engineering firm in Germany, helped build the centrifuges in Iran. There was a particular facility in Natanz, and this was given a lot of attention by the West because it was thought this could be a place where they were enriching uranium, which for a long time the Iranians denied. Iran was a member of the NPT, is a member of the NPT, not the official treaty. It was supposed to be amenable to nuclear weapons inspections, the kind of stuff that George Moore talked about, the IAEA inspection and safeguard system. But they're very good at concealment, and it took a long time before it was understood the vast nature of the Natanz enrichment capability. Then, once there was all this attention to Natanz, there was focus on the second site, which was hidden for a long time, until it was discovered it was at Qum. Qum is the most holy site in Islam, in Iran, the most holy Shia site in Islam. Many of the Iraqi Shia leaders all spent time studying Qum. So the U.S. response to all this was largely to lead the global movement on economic sanctions as a penalty for Iran's NPT violations, because Iran is part of the NPT and a non-nuclear state, not allowed to get into this business. At the same time, Iran, with the help of the Pakistanis, the North Koreans, the Libyans, developed substantial ballistic missile capabilities, systems that didn't have intercontinental range, but that could threaten, of course, Israel, which is not that far, Saudi Arabia, not that far, and European targets. So this was an issue that President Bush was grappling with throughout his tenure. The growth of Iran's military capability, its nuclear program, and its anti-Western policies in the Middle East. In the latter phase of the Bush administration, a very smart guy at STRATCOM, Strategic Command, the successor to the Strategic Air Command, which controlled U.S. nuclear weapons, and General James Cartwright, Marine Corps general, but very knowledgeable about these items. And Cartwright is considered to be the father of the idea that possibly using cyber techniques that STRATCOM had developed, they could use cyber weapons to attack Iranian centrifuges. Now this would fit in later on with the Obama approach, not boots on the ground. The policy still has the same objective, but different means. And this was also in the early days in the late Bush administration of the development of what became Cyber Command, which was approved by Secretary of Defense Gates and President Obama in 2010 or so, of the first Obama. So Bush briefed Obama during the transition from Bush to Obama at the start of 2009 on this cyber capability. and Obama agreed to use it against the Iranians. This approach was helped along by the fact that the Americans went to Siemens and found a lot of information from Siemens about the programmable logic controllers that control the centrifuges. That was very decisive. The Obama team also was in close touch with Israel. Israel has strong intelligence capabilities, and Israel had already adopted a different technique against the Iranian nuclear program, and that was targeted assassinations. So there would be Iranian nuclear scientists in their cars on the way to work, and motorcycles would come up to the side of the car, and the motorcycle rider would put something on the side of the car, which would be explosive, and turn away, and the car would go. This is not the typical Berkeley seminar type part of the work. No kidding. You want to kill me? I'll kill you first. That's good. So Obama was concerned that this might delay the Iranian program somewhat, but it never would turn it back. It wouldn't change Iranian strategy or policy. And Obama was concerned that if this continued, that ultimately Israel would attack Iran. Now, Israel had launched aircraft against the Osiris reactor in Iraq in 1981 and destroyed it. And they had attacked a Syrian nuclear reactor that Syria obtained from North Korea in 2007 and destroyed that. Israel never said that they did it. Iraq and Syria never said that it was done to them. But Iraq and Syria did not continue their programs after those attacks. So one interesting distinction between Israel and the US is the US has never used force against a country that's a new nuclear state. Right? I mean, the US was the first in 1945. The Soviet Union was second. We didn't use force against the Soviet Union. The British in 1952, we didn't use force against them. The French in 1960, we didn't use force against them. The Chinese in 1964, we didn't use force against them. The Israelis, we didn't use force against them. The Indians and Pakistanis, we didn't use force against them. And North Koreans, we haven't used force against them. So there's no history at all. I mean, the US plays tough. There's no history of use of military force by the United States against a new nuclear state. Whereas in the neighborhood where Israel felt most threatened, in the case of Iraq and Syria, they did use nuclear force. They did use military force. And over this issue, relations between Obama and Netanyahu, now was already he's the longest serving prime minister in Israel history, became very frosty, to put it mildly. It's interesting because I served in the Obama Pentagon in 2009, 2010 when some of this was going on. And if you didn't think about the high-level Obama and Netanyahu thing, you'd never know that there were problems. Because Israelis were in the Pentagon every day. There was shared intelligence all the time. There's lots of military planning going on jointly. But at the highest level, where the core objective should be, there was really deep hostility between Obama and Netanyahu. Another source of Obama's hostility toward Netanyahu was that Obama had initially asked George Mitchell, who was Senate Majority Leader, to be the special emissary to try to get the Palestinian-Israeli peace talks started. And Obama became convinced that Netanyahu was not interested in peace with the Palestinians. He was interested in controlling the Palestinians. And I think also it's fair to say that Obama had sympathy, is sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinians in a way that Bush wasn't particularly sympathetic, but certainly that Trump was. So you have all that going on at the same time. So we have Israel targeted assassinations of Iranian scientists and engineers. The Bush administration beginning cyber capability of scrap power. The endorsement by Obama of that, attacking the program logic control devices of the centrifuges. And then the development of this worm, the Stuxnet worm. I use in my other classes a wonderful book by David Sanger, from the New York Times, current New York Times, national security correspondent, who was deeply knowledgeable about this, had been briefed many times. He actually just spoke a few weeks ago here across the street at the hall where Citrus is. And what the Stuxnet did was, it got into their systems in such a way that the Iranians didn't understand. And they didn't understand that this was basically an external attack on their capabilities. They thought there was honestly a malfunction of their capabilities. And several thousand centrifuges malfunctioned. Ultimately, the Iranians understood what happened. What's critically important, and in terms of precedent, is that the Stuxnet attack is the first time that cyber was used to destroy facilities. Not just to make your email not work, not just to gain intelligence information, it's to physically destroy something. And this raises a fundamental question, what's the precedent of this? Is it valuable? Was it the right thing to do? Neither Obama nor Netanyahu, who approved it, ever believed that it would stop the Iranian program, only that it would delay the Iranian program. Okay. So, from an American perspective, the reasons for the cyber attack were, one, to delay the Iranian program, two, to preclude the Iranian regime from acquiring weapons that would enhance their own stability and prestige. So an argument was that the Iranians, which were suffering economically under the sanctions, maybe the Iranians would rise up and overthrow the Khamenei, and that his ace in the hole was to get nuclear weapons, which would be a huge prestige to Iran. So by denying that capability, that could actually undermine the stability of the regime. So one is a more narrow objective about the program itself, delaying the weapons program. The second is a political objective about undermining the regime stability. The third was to reduce the threat that Iran would pose in the region. And a fourth, from an American perspective, was to reduce the likelihood that Israel would itself attack the centrifuges by air. Now that's a big deal actually for the Israelis. They've never flown that far. It's like 1,000 miles to get from Israel to the proper Iranian targets. They've never flown that distance. And we now know from the documents and published articles that the Israelis themselves were deeply divided about whether to attack. But at one point, around this time in the Obama administration, both Netanyahu and Barak, who had been former prime minister and defense minister, both supported an attack. But the Israeli military had questions about the feasibility of it. And a top other figure who was very prestigious named Meir, who was the head of Mossad, also opposed the attack. And he actually resigned over this issue. So it wasn't that Israel was united itself on the wisdom of such. Yes.
Does Israel have intercontinental?
No, Israel does not have independence. Other thoughts about this? Yes.
I read an article about how hardened Iran's nuclear
Right.
systems were. Could Israel have destroyed them even if they wanted to?
It's not clear, and especially in Qum, I think there are real reservations whether they can attack. They're deeply underground, they're hardened. Tons of concrete, they've got metal doors on top of it. And you actually do blast calculations, even with a nuclear weapon. So, and this was, it was always thought that Israel would use non-nuclear weapons to attack the Iranian nuclear facilities. They would not be the first to use nuclear weapons. Yes.
I think right before break, Israel admitted to striking the reactor
In Syria,
in Syria.
yes, that just happened.
Right.
Israel just acknowledged that they attacked the Syrian reactor.
And like, what do you think? Like, why do you think they announced that now? And what do you think the issues are for?
I think it's a message to the Iranians. It's a reminder that they're not willing to sit by and have a state that's dedicated to the destruction continue to develop weapons to be used in the destruction. Or whether the message is received and how it's interpreted.
When Iran says like death to Israel as their like key centerpiece of their foreign policy, how seriously does Israel take that as like a literal death?
They take it quite seriously. That's because of other things that are going on in the region, as well as nuclear stuff. We haven't discussed this in this class. So, for example, just in recent years, Iran has developed a wide range of ballistic missiles, including medium range and intermediate, medium range and shorter range ballistic missiles. They have worked with Hezbollah. So Hezbollah is now not just, Hezbollah was from the party of God. It was founded during the Israeli-Syrian wars of the early 80s. Hezbollah now is used as an expeditionary force by Iran. Hezbollah forces are in Syria, they're in Yemen, and they're in Iraq to do Iran's bidding. Iran has developed very close ties, and this is relatively recent, with the Russians. They are it's a combined Russian, Iranian, Hezbollah consortium that's keeping Assad in power with the help of its current president, who seems to be very supportive of Russian policy. So Iran is acting very aggressively in the region, and that's only reinforcing the Israeli concern that they are a real threat. Because they can, if you look at them, you have to look at the details of the map. If you look at the map, they're seeing an encirclement of Israel by Iranian forces. The Iranians have said that that Israel's demise is not imminent, but in 25 years it will no longer exist. They specifically said 25 years. Other questions or thoughts here? Okay. So, let's see what we have here. So I think we've discussed most of these things. The purposes for the centrifuge attack, the cyber, the Stuxnet attack, that the U.S. had never attacked a new nuclear weapon state, that Israel has attacked incipient nuclear weapon states, and that Israel in general is concerned about the sort of containment policy of Iran. They don't, the Netanyahu regime, and of course Israel is divided, but the Netanyahu regime doesn't think that that's credible, and because they're not being contained. Their programs and their activities in the region are all very expansionist. They're very aggressive. So, as the Obama administration proceeded, Obama came closer to the view that it was worth it to try a negotiation with Iran, which had never been done. We haven't talked to these guys since 1979. There's no diplomatic relations between the US and Iran. So that's this first point. And it is the end result of these negotiations, not the name of the negotiations, the end result of these negotiations is a joint comprehensive plan of action, the JCPOA. Now this gets itself a little complicated. The joint plan of action was considered to be possibly feasible if there was sufficient economic sanctions against Iran that it really hurt their economy. And for the longest time under Bush, economic sanctions were not that comprehensive because the Germans and the French and the Italians, who were doing billions of dollars in business with Iran, didn't want sanctions. Their governments were pressed by their economic interests to avoid sanctions because there was too much money involved. And there were some voices in the US also that opposed sanctions for that reason. But Bush had led with economic sanctions. Under Obama, the sanctions broadened and deepened, and especially as Iranian policies became more aggressive, they began to bite the Iranian government. Now, there's a whole argument, there's a whole literature now on economic sanctions. Are economic sanctions intended to hurt the man in the street? Are they intended to hurt the leadership? You know, I mean, the leadership of a lot of these countries have palaces in Switzerland, and they've got, you know, they have bank accounts in these countries. Is that what you want to hurt? Or do you want to hurt the people who might rise up against the regime? It was felt that this would be a combined effort in Iran. Also, the policy was started at a time when there was a decline of global oil prices, which also strengthened the pain of the Iranian economy, which had nothing to do with this, so just with other issues. So the negotiations went on for almost 2 years, and during that time, here's what Iran was doing, and the negotiations were just about the nuclear issue, which was itself another major disagreement with Obama and Netanyahu. Netanyahu said, no, we have to put all these issues on the table. Their support of Hezbollah and Hamas, their ballistic missile program, their role of Hezbollah in Yemen. There's a whole comprehensive security. Obama said, look, I don't have 7 centuries to negotiate this. It'll be tough enough to negotiate an agreement on nuclear. And that's the core, the top American objective is to prevent an Iranian nuclear capability. That's the top objective. So during the negotiations itself, they expanded their nuclear program, Iran did. They activated Hezbollah as an intervention force in Syria and Yemen. Iran strengthened ties with Russia to support Assad in Syria. Assad is a Alawite, which is a Shia offshoot. Syria is a Sunni country led by a Shia leader. And to fight ISIS, which is a Sunni Arab group. Iran has been deeply involved in Iraq to fight US forces and to influence Iraqi government policies. Many of the Iraqi leaders of today have the closest ties with Iran. And we lost a lot of guys to prevent that eventuality. In fact, there were many specialists who said the whole side effect of the American involvement in Iraq would be to greatly strengthen Iran's influence in Iraq. And of course, Iran continued domestically with very deep human rights violations. People who demonstrated against the government disappeared, they went to prison, they were tortured. So it wasn't as though Iran was playing we'll behave ourselves during the negotiations. They were going full bore, following their own policies while conducting these negotiations with the Americans. As I mentioned, the Obama-Netanyahu Gulf. Obama wanted the negotiations solely on nuclear issues. Netanyahu on all the security issues. And this is a time when Netanyahu was threatening military attack. Here I have Dagan, the Mossad chief who resigned over military attacks. Finally, after a fair amount of negotiation, and by this, another thing, by the way, that happened, this is another issue that was important, is that, you might not remember this, but in the 2008 presidential campaign in the US, Obama had said he'd be willing to go to talk to the Iranians or the North Koreans if it could lead to progress on the nuclear program. And Hillary Clinton vehemently attacked Obama, saying you're naive, you don't just talk to these guys, this is a tremendous prestigious value for any of the leaders to speak to an American president. You don't just go there without getting a lot in return. So here Obama had a middle ground of having our negotiators with their negotiators. And of course, in 2012, Clinton resigned as Secretary of State. She would have been the lead negotiator. And she was replaced by Senator Kerry, who became very active as a negotiator. Key people in the U.S. negotiation with Iran were Kerry as Secretary of State, Bernie Moniz, the nuclear engineer from MIT, who became Secretary of Energy under Obama, and Wendy Sherman, who was actually a longtime colleague of Madeleine Albright's. She was under Secretary of State for Political Affairs. Those three were the dominant figures. In fact, Wendy Sherman recently wrote an op-ed in the Times about keeping the JCPOA alive. November 3rd, 2013 was the initial beginning of the effort to focus just on the key terms of an agreement, JCPOA. And that took a year and a half to hammer out, November 13th to July 15th. Who's sitting around the table? And we're going to do a little simulation on this next week, so get a chance to be more active than passive about this. The U.S., and the other nuclear weapon states, the P5, Russia, China, UK, and France, Iran, of course, Germany, because of its strong economic interests in Iran, and the European Union. It's a very complex arrangement. Any questions at this point? Okay, so what are the main terms of the JCPOA, which was signed in July 2015? Now, by the way, you have to appreciate, if I haven't mentioned this, there's a distinction between an executive agreement and a treaty in the United States. An executive agreement is something that's signed by the president or his duly authorized a representative, but it's not presented to the Congress for approval. A treaty has to be confirmed by 2/3 of the Senate. It is often the case that a president signs an executive agreement because he doesn't think he can get 2/3 of the Senate. That was the case here. There was tremendous opposition to this agreement. So they didn't call it a treaty, they called it an executive agreement. Iran agreed to a whole bunch of efforts that would curtail its nuclear program, to eliminate its stockpile of medium enriched uranium, 20% level. You know, an enrichment, I don't know if Professor Burns mentioned this, it's a highly nonlinear process. Where you get from 3 or 4% to 20%, it's hard, but to get from 20 to 90 is not so hard. And they would have to give up all of their medium enriched uranium. They would have to cut their stockpile of low enriched uranium almost totally. They'd have to reduce their centrifuges by 2/3 over 13 years. They would only be able to enrich to a tiny amount, 3.67%. No heavy water facilities during the same period. The existing uranium enrichment facilities that were operational were limited to one first-generation centrifuge for 10 years. This is a huge downgrading of their capability from what it had been before the JCPOA. And in return, they would also have to agree to regular IAEA inspections, George Moore type inspections, on-site inspections of all Iranian facilities. The term that was used in the JCPOA is the agreement is based on a rules-based non-proliferation regime created by the NPT, including the IAEA safeguard system. I'm at F8. I lost my and what did Iran get in return from all of this? They got money. F9. Great, thank you. They received relief, basically funds that had been frozen by the US, the European Union, and the Security Council, the UN. Now, they had been subject to sanctions for various issues, not only nuclear issues. So this opened up the coffers for the sanctions for nuclear-related issues. And I don't know if you remember, but after it was signed, over $1 billion was sent to them right away. And this infuriated many Americans. Trump actually was one of the vocal critics of it. And interestingly enough, so was Netanyahu. And for the first time, I believe it's the first time in US history, the Republican-dominated Congress invited the Israeli Prime Minister to address a joint session of Congress about the mistakes of the Obama JCPOA. This had never been done before. To invite a foreign leader to Congress to denounce the executive agreement. And Netanyahu gave a very stirring critique of the agreement, which included the fact that it's a finite term limit on their capabilities. So yeah, maybe for 10 years, but what happens in the 11th year? 11th year, they're back in business. And there's nothing in there about what happens in the 11th year. After the time limit, they were able to proceed with their program. Once the sanctions are lifted, it took such a hard time to get all these guys together. Once they're lifted, there's no way you'll be able to reimpose them if they violated the agreement. You can't get the Germans and the French and the Italians and everybody else to do it. It doesn't limit any of the other belligerent non-nuclear Iranian activity. And even if it did, the IAEA safeguards, because the Iranians are so clever, still might not detect all of the Iranian agreement violations. So those were the core criticisms, F10, by Netanyahu of the agreement. Yeah. Trump as a candidate, you know, he ridiculed almost every treaty and executive agreement that Obama signed. The Trans-Pacific Partnership on Trade in Asia, the Paris Climate Change Agreement on climate change. And this one maybe more than any. He called this the worst agreement ever signed by an American president. The catastrophe. And he used the most hyperbolic language. So what has happened since Trump's been in office? Well, it's a moving target. What's happened is, skip over some of the details, Trump had to specify that Iran was in compliance with the agreement. He didn't want to do that, but he didn't want to actually pull out from the agreement. Actually, he did, but his advisor said no. In the most recent iteration, which is very recent, Trump has specified May 12th, today, April 4th, 6 weeks from now, May 12th, as a final date to waive sanctions or leave the deal. And the fact that Trump has recently appointed John Bolton as National Security Advisor over Master League, and Pompeo, CIA Director, as Secretary of State with Tillerson League, these are two hyperhawks who've been equally super critical of the Iran agreement. So if there are people in the room when Trump makes this decision, presumably Bolton and Pompeo will be there, and they'll be counseling Trump to leave the agreement. By the way, Bolton had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in February on the legality of American military attack on North Korea. And I don't know if you saw it, but Mattis, who's the Secretary of Defense and considered the more moderate member of this group, was greeted by Bolton. Bolton went to visit him in the Pentagon. This made national news just last week. And as Bolton walked up the steps of the Pentagon, Mattis greeted him and said, "I'm glad to finally meet you. I understand you're the devil incarnate." This was all over the front page of every paper of America and every television station last week, but I know you never watch television. Newspapers do it. In the meantime, Trump has directed some of his diplomats to work with the European Union on what would be some new terms of the JCPOA. And over 100 former diplomats and generals have signed a statement urging the U.S. to stay in the agreement as long as the IAEA certifies Iran is still in compliance. So this is an ongoing situation. It's a critical situation. And it's also related to your project problem, because it's not as though this is hermetically sealed from the rest of the world. And North Korea, it's supposed to have its leader, Kim Jong-un, meet with Trump in May on their nuclear program, will be vastly influenced by Trump's decision whether he's going to pull out of the JCPOA. Yes?
Do you think that Trump's point Bolton was influenced by this meeting happening? And that article, that op-ed that was published?
It's possible. I mean, it's hard to speculate on Trump's motives. I mean, you can speculate, but it's hard to do. I mean, what people say is he watches Fox News incessantly. Bolton is a regular on Fox News. At one point, he considered appointing Bolton at the beginning of the administration, but he said he was very bothered by Bolton's mustache. Bolton has a handlebar mustache. Trump says, "Yeah, I don't like it. People want to tell a jet." But evidently he's overcome it, because Bolton hasn't shaved off the mustache. And he said from the outset that he likes Bolton's aggressiveness, he likes his assertiveness, he's very articulate. Bolton is a very smart guy. I had an opportunity to have a dinner with him, with 8 people, several years ago. Listening is not his strong suit, but he's very good at articulating his viewpoints. He's Yale honors graduate, Yale Law School, super smart, and very strongly held views. So, but it's one thing to talk about it on Fox News. It's nothing in the White House to the president, and you're facing possible big-time issues here. So it's just hard to know. I would say that Senator Corker, who's a more moderate Republican for Tennessee, who chairs the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he said with Bolton and Pompeo's appointment that he thought that on May 12th, he made a public statement, which is unusual, that on May 12th, Trump would withdraw from the JCPOA. It is not a bluff, he's going to do it. So what will happen? Well, in the meantime, one thing that will happen is Iran will be totally free to restart its program. And all of these constraints, 1 through 6, will be off the table. It's possible it could lead to Israel rethinking military action. Yes?
But isn't it multilateral? Like, is our withdrawal from the agreement like just complete
would it completely dissolve the agreement?
Well, so that's actually a serious question. There's nothing to preclude the other parties to the agreement to stay in the agreement or to reach a new agreement. Nothing to prevent that. But it's thought that the U.S. is such a big dog in the fight that if the U.S. pulled out, there's no way that Britain or France would stay in and things would collapse.
So, what advice do you think right now is going on between Saudi Arabia's leaders and Trump with respect to the JCPOA?
Yeah, so this is another key element. So the Saudis, Trump has been closer to the Saudis than any prior American president. It was his first foreign trip. He extolled the virtues of Saudi democracy, which exists. He's fostered a 1-2-3 agreement for nuclear energy cooperation with the Saudis. This is the beginning of what could be a nuclear weapons program for Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have stated, when I was leaving government in 2010, I gave a talk to a group, and the Saudi defense attaché in the Saudi embassy in Washington came up to me and said, I just want you to know, it's not a secret, that if you let Iran get nuclear weapons, we'll follow right away. We'll get nuclear weapons right away. Now, where they have them on order from Pakistan, they have an Amazon order from them. They can't get them alone. They don't have the capability to build them alone. They can buy it. They have a lot of cash. There's a question whether Pakistan will want to do that. Pakistan is the only Islamic state with nuclear weapons. Do they want to be one of two Islamic states with nuclear weapons? Maybe not. So when you think about the possibilities of F-11 of the U.S. withdrawing, there is not only the issue of the future status of the agreement, of military action by Israel, of the Iranian resumption of its own program, but of proliferation consequences. Saudi Arabia, possibly Egypt and Turkey are also thought to be top contenders to move toward nuclear weapon status. So ironically, Trump's concern about the weaknesses of this JCPOA that would lead him to withdraw could be a major proliferatory act, which is not something that he supported. Yes.
But do you think in the meetings right now that there could be like a similar deal to the JCPOA with Saudi Arabia for them not to proliferate either?
No. I mean, JCPOA was a hyper-complex 18-month sustained negotiation. Probably don't. You haven't been part of this, don't have a clue as to the enormous complexity of this type of thing. Just do it like that, not a chance. And not only that, there's no U.S. interest, frankly, or capability to generate this kind of negotiation.
What sort of relations does Iran have with Pakistan? They share a border.
They have sort of mixed relations. Of course, one is Persian Shia, one is Arab Sunni. But the Pakistanis have played a role in missile capabilities with Iran. It's a mixed relationship. It's not purely adversarial, nor is it purely intimate alliance. It's issue by issue. Yes.
Was there a lot of internal pressure in Iran before JCPOA to go to the negotiating table and potentially grow their nuclear weapons program? I mean, from the economic sanctions and how that affected the economy?
I mean, the Iranians were deeply divided about the JCPOA themselves. And in fact, it was alleged that for the longest time, Khomeini was the last man sane in Iran. He opposed the agreement. He didn't want these constraints on the agreement. But he ultimately agreed to it because it was made convincing to him that the pain of the economy was going to be a threat to the regime if we didn't do something to get economic relief. And this was the way to get economic relief, which is, of course, what the American strategy was all about: impose economic pain to get the nuclear deal. But this is totally a calculation that Trump is not interested in. if you believe what he says. Now, you know, he could change his mind tomorrow and say, you know, everything's great with Iran, and I love him. He's nice to me, you know, all that sort of stuff. But, yes.
So I think Pompeo and Bolton have both advocated regime change in North Korea. Have they said anything along those lines with respect to Iran?
Yeah, Bolton has advocated regime change in Iran. So this is, you know, a direct threat. And what is it in what? April 9th, what's today, April 4th? April 9th is Monday. Bolton will be the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. He'll be in the White House. So this is not just an abstract, theoretical, Berkeley, academic calculation on the other side of Pluto. We don't know what will happen. This is immediate. This is happening right now. And you'll get a chance to play with this a little bit in the simulation next week. We'll send out some stuff on Friday about it. You'll all have to look. Any other questions or comments? Great. See you next week.